So you're interested in Greek mythology. Well, my name's Jean, I'm an ancient historian, and I'm here today to help you sort of maybe not begin, but continue your journey into the world of Greek mythology. So before we start this video, I'm assuming that maybe, you've watched the TV shows, you've seen the films adapted from Greek myth, you've listened to some podcasts, maybe you grew up hearing the stories or reading them in children's book, maybe you've even read my children's book on the topic, and maybe you've read a bunch of modern day retellings. You don't have to have done any of that, but whatever has whetted your appetite, whatever has brought you to this subject has sort of laid the foundations, whether it be a trip to the museum, whether it be a conversation with a friend, or like I mentioned, a favourite retelling. And now you want more. Now you want to sort of dive into the ancient material itself. You want to understand the significance, prominence, importance, purpose of Greek mythology, and you want to read those ancient texts, whether they be from the 6th century BCE or the 2nd century CE. It does not matter. They are all equally important. They are all equally relevant to the study of Greek mythology, and that's what I'm going to share with you in this video. I have divided my recommendations and book discussions into 3 sections for this video. So the first section is a little bit of context, background, a little bit of non-fiction reading. There's just a couple of books, some sort of shorter and quicker and more introductory than others, and some a little bit more in depth. Then we have section 2, which is the largest section, and that is a section all about the ancient material. So we're going to be looking at what the ancient Greeks themselves wrote. Now, of course, ancient Greek mythology continues to live on. It was popular in the medieval era, it's popular in the modern era, it has changed and evolved and means different things to different people throughout time, and there are those that still worship these gods. But I'm assuming you're interested in what the ancients had to say, what maybe those in 5th century Athens believed, were reading about, we're going to see at festivals, what those in the 1st century CE were worshipping and telling to their children and their loved ones. Those are the stories we're going to be focusing on, and then in the 3rd section of this video I'm just going to do a little bit of further reading, maybe a little bit beyond what I've covered so far in this video that might be of interest to you. But one of the things I think is really important to establish before we get into the texts themselves is that Greek mythology is not a fixed, immovable thing, even in antiquity. And the term ancient Greece itself is actually a bit of a misnomer. So we are talking about civilizations that existed for at least a millennia, whose mythology was influenced by those who came before, those who came during, those they interacted with and encountered throughout those centuries. But the texts I'm going to be showing to you in this video cover almost an entire millennia's worth of literature. And of course those myths and the understanding of those myths and the significance of those myths and the versions of those myths that exist might change over time. Some of those changes, a lot of those changes really, are very intentional and explicit, and even the ancients themselves were sort of adapting and changing these myths consciously, not just subconsciously, not by accident, but intentionally. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I talk about the texts themselves. Writers, dramatists, poets, etc., politicians, rhetoricians had intent when they were telling these stories, and therefore they told these stories to further that intent. I myself did an entire PhD thesis on the way in which 4th century court speeches, so we're talking about legal suits, political cases, public speeches, rhetoricians who were telling Greek myths, who were using Greek myths in their speeches to prove political points. And of course they are going to adapt those myths to what suits them best. So the myths change, the myths are manipulated, and there is very, very, very rarely only one version of a myth. If there's only one version of a myth that exists in the ancient material, there likely were more that existed back in antiquity, we just don't have them. So when you do read a myth in one of these books, say, it's always worth bearing in mind there's likely to be another version. It may only vary slightly, but it may vary quite starkly. So reading as much as possible and reading different variations is one of the best tips I can give you when it comes to reading Greek mythology. And then I also think it's worth bearing in mind that ancient Greece is a bit of a modern concept, because what we talk about when we talk about ancient Greece are those who spoke the ancient Greek language, which were a number of different city-states who considered themselves quite independent from one another. They had different political systems, they had different monarchies, they had different legal systems, and there was also local variation when it came to their myth and what those myths meant to them, how they worshipped their gods. what their gods did and did not do. So that of course is also worth bearing in mind, but that's also why I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the non-fiction I am in part 1. So without further ado, let's crack on and discuss some books that might give you some context for then reading the ancient myths themselves. So if you came into this video looking for a sort of modern or recent kind of summary of all of Greek mythology, a book that is a compendium or compilation of everything out there, then that's not what this video is going to focus on, but I am going to mention one book that maybe falls into that category, just in case that's what you would like, or at least that's something you'd like to have beside you whilst you're reading the Greek myths. And this is one that I think is a good recommendation because it's written by an academic. There's a lot of citation, there's a lot of sort of evidence and material provided, which is not always the case. I mean, understandably, say in a children's book there's not space for like an in-depth academic analysis of all of the myths. Then there is also modern compendiums of myths that maybe take early modern versions of an ancient Greek myth as the ancient version, and it all gets a little bit twisted. But I think Jenny March's book here, The Penguin Book of Classical Myths, is one that you can reasonably reliably trust. Of course, like I said, there's different versions of every myth, but it will give you a really great overview of the main mythological cycles, the main mythological stories and figures, what their significance was, and you can read their stories in here just like you might read any other short story or narrative or novel, what have you, but with, you know, those sort of ancient sources referenced, which I think is really important if you're looking to get into this subject a little bit more in depth. So yeah, I would recommend this book if you're looking for something like that. I then wanted to mention another book by an academic colleague of mine who I greatly admire, that is Dr. Ellie Mackin-Roberts, which is The Heroines of Olympus, the Women of Greek Mythology. Now obviously this one has a very particular focus. We're looking at the women, we're looking at the goddesses, the heroines, those women that maybe are sometimes forgotten about or overlooked or overshadowed by their male counterparts in modern discussions. And what I love about this book is it's incredibly accessible. Like, this is the kind of book you can pick up with no background whatsoever, just a vague interest in the subject, but you know you're getting something with incredible foundations that is, you know, based on the research of an incredible scholar who, like I said, greatly admire, who's thought very carefully about the information they're including and how they're presenting it, but they are presenting it in an accessible way. I think ignoring the importance of accessibility is a massive failing of the academic discipline as a whole. I think accessibility is incredibly important. It's where we all start. In fact, there's no reason that most subjects can't be accessible at different stages, and I think this is one that will definitely sort of give you that little bit of an accessible touch, as well as being really, really informative. And of course it is worth noting at this point that mythological stories have a religious connection. These are stories that are generally about gods, goddesses, but then also the heroes and heroines and other figures and creatures and monsters, etc., that are related to or interact with gods and goddesses. Maybe they're descendant of them, maybe they are the feature of prophecies, but they have this connection with religion. So of course religion is an important part of understanding those myths, but you can just read them and enjoy them and find them entertaining, or you can learn something from them, or, like, as is one of my favourite things to do, you can get a little bit deeper and you can start to learn the historical context and significance of these myths in the setting in which they were being told and shared and sort of passed down. And in order to do that, you might want a little bit of non-fiction. So next up, I actually have a very tiny little book, but one I think is absolutely phenomenal for anyone interested in this subject. A great place to start, whether you've read the myths already or whether you're about to, or whether you want to read it alongside them. This is a very short introduction to classical mythology by Helen Morales, and it's part of the Oxford's Very Short Introduction series, which I think is a fantastic series in itself. And I will say that this is obviously about classical mythology, which is a term that is usually used to sort of delineate the mythology of the ancient Mediterranean. So we're also talking about like Roman mythology, but while classical mythology itself is a discipline, I'm not specifically covering Roman mythology in this video because they are distinct, they are interwoven, they are connected. Sure, they are very, yeah, they're very, very intertwined, don't get me wrong, but they're also distinct. So I am focusing on Greek mythology in this video, but this is a great little introduction to the concept of classical mythology, what it meant to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, a few of the myths themselves, and just like a little bit of a sort of foundation for your learning. But if you're looking for something a little bit more intense, a little bit chunkier, then I would highly recommend really all of the work by Lowell Edmonds. He's done a ton of fantastic books on mythology. If you, for example, actually just to chuck in another book here, if you want a book on one specific myth, for example, and kind of the variations of it. Lowell Edmonds has also written Stealing Helen, which is purely on myths similar to and versions of the Helen of Troy myth, which, you know, like, fantastic book. But this book here, more broadly, is all about approaches to Greek mythology. I mean, the title's pretty self-explanatory when it comes to this one, but I think it's a fantastic book if you want to get that nitty-gritty, you know. You don't need to, like, don't get me wrong, you do not need to read this book to read the ancient texts I'm going to talk about next, but if you want something a little bit more nitty-gritty, a little bit more in-depth, a little bit more like tearing the myths apart and like why we read them, etc., then this is the book. And then the last book I wanted to mention in this portion of the video is Art, Myth and Ritual in Classical Greece by Judith M. Barringer. I've actually had this book since I went to university for the first time, 2010, first year of university, when Professor Barringer was actually one of my lecturers at university, and I bought this for one of the courses she taught, and it's been an excellent compendium. It was a great introduction back then to specifically, you know, the material culture that preserves mythology, because of course when it comes to understanding antiquity, a lot of our, you know, sort of evidence for these periods is archaeological and material as opposed to literary. You know, so much literature survives, we're so lucky, but it's only a fraction of what there would have been, and some of the myths that we actually know or understand are because of, say, vase paintings and frescoes and sculptures, and I think that's also really, really important. So this book may therefore give you a better appreciation and understanding of that, and although I'm not going to be talking about vases for the rest of this video, I thought it'd be fun to bear in mind before we get into the classical texts themselves. So that brings me to section 2 of this video, which is the ancient texts themselves, exclusively Greek texts. So I again wanted to focus on Greek mythology in this video. That does not mean there are only Greek writers writing about Greek mythology. There are also ancient Roman writers who wrote about Greek mythology. For example, you might wonder, where is Ovid in this video? He wrote a lot about Greek mythology, although sometimes a little bit controversially in terms of his adaptations and alterations to the myth. And of course, if you're getting more into Greek mythology and classical mythology as a whole, then there's something you might want to check out in the future. But for the sake of like keeping things ancient Greek, I'm going to talk about the ancient Greek texts themselves here, and I'm going to try and go vaguely chronologically. We don't always know the exact date a book was written, but I'm just going to go from sort of like oldest to most recent and cover, like I said, almost a whole millennia of literature with them and tell you a little bit more about each book as we go and what you might expect from it. Alright, so let's get it over with. The obvious one's gotta come first. Would it be a video about Greek mythology without the inclusion of Homer? No, I don't think it would. So let's talk a little bit about Homeric poetry. So we have 2 epic poems which survive, which are attributed to the poet Homer. Whether that is correct or not correct is not a subject for this video. It does not matter. We have 2 books. We have the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, what I mean by epic poetry is that these were long-form narrative poems that told a long story. So, you know, like we've got like novel length but in verse, and you will find translations of these poems both in verse in English as well as in prose, which might help if you're a little bit intimidated by the verse format itself. Both of these that I'm holding up now are verse translations, and one of the reasons that these stories exist as poems is that poetry would have been the go-to format for telling these stories. In fact, what you will notice is that none of the texts in this video were originally written in prose. They were either poetry or they were in play format, so I will be discussing some tragic plays as well. But poetry was how most mythology was shared, unless, like I said before, it was maybe included in Herodotus as a little mention, or it was included in a court speech, which would have been in prose, etc. But generally myth was shared in the format of poetry, because in an oral culture prior to having them written down, that would have been easier to remember. You know, it would have given a rhythm to the story that would have helped the storyteller storytelling. It would have been good for both entertainment value and memorizing them. So that's like a little bit of context for that. But going back to the Archaic Era, we have these two poems which are attributed to Homer, one of which is the Iliad. Now the Iliad is essentially the story of Achilles' sort of final days. So whilst this story is set during the Trojan War, it is not an account of the entirety of the Trojan War. You do get some sort of callbacks and some context, etc. But the main narrative is set over the course of just the last few days of Achilles' life. So not even the last few days of the Trojan War, although this is very much near the end of the Trojan War, is the last few days in Achilles' life. What happens when he has a big fallout with Agamemnon, what happens when his lover slash friend Patroclus dies, his grief, his rage, and all of the emotions and turmoil that he's going through, and it's very much how he's feeling about the whole thing, and how he reacts to it all until his death. Like I said, it's in the last few days of his life. But through it you do get insight into various threads of the Trojan War story, and you do learn a little bit about the gods and their involvement in the Trojan War. And obviously the Trojan War, you've probably heard mentioned, even if you don't know the story of it, is a very, very big part of Greek mythology, and it will continue to get referenced in pretty much every genre of literature throughout ancient Greek history. Like, it comes up all the time, so it's always good to have a little bit of context for that. And then, not a sequel to the Iliad, but set after the Iliad is the Odyssey. This is the journey of the hero Odysseus on his return home from the Trojan War, where he was on the Greek side, to his home in Ithaca, a journey which takes years. And we see what was going on with his wife and his son whilst he was away, as well as what happens to him along this journey. And for me personally, of the two books, I find this the most enjoyable to read, I guess, because it has that kind of like adventure structure. We see lots of different islands and creatures and characters and gods, and it's exciting, whereas I find the Iliad like a bit of a whinge fest on behalf of Achilles, which is, you know, it's very much personal preference. That's not like an academic perspective, that is just a reading for enjoyment perspective. I enjoy this book more, but they are obviously both really, really important texts in terms of their influence. Like, later writers will not just reference these stories which exist beyond Homer, but they will reference Homer because he was such an icon. So, you know, that's worth bearing in mind. Then, while we're on the topic of Homer, I have to mention the Homeric hymns. Now, whilst the poems in this collection are referred to as the Homeric hymns, they were not written by Homer, and that's not even up for debate. They are simply referred to as the Homeric hymns because they survive from a similar period and we do not know the authors of them. But these are all hymns, so religious poems and songs that are addressed to the gods and goddesses of ancient Greek mythology themselves. Some of which are shorter and maybe just like give you a little bit of context to the character of the god, what they meant to the person worshipping them, whilst others include myths and stories themselves. So myth, or the word mythos from ancient Greek, simply translates to story, so I am going to sort of use those interchangeably here, but of course when I say story I'm talking about a myth. But yeah, so for example we have the oldest version of Persephone's abduction by Hades recorded in the hymn to Demeter in this collection, but there are various different hymns. So there is hymns to Artemis, so there's hymns to Aphrodite, there's hymns to Dionysus, Ares, etc. And this is a great collection if you want that introduction to the gods and goddesses, is particularly the Olympian gods and goddesses of Greek mythology. If you want that context, if you want to know more about why they were worshipped, what they did, what their background was, who they were as characters, because, you know, they had very distinct personalities, these gods and goddesses. They were not all good, benevolent beings. They had emotions and they did some not so great stuff. So I think this is, yeah, really great for context in terms of the gods and goddesses. Then lastly, for the Archaic Era of Greek history, we have Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days, which is technically two didactic poems written by Hesiod, but they both achieve similar things. They are both very much about the foundation of the universe in Greek mythology and the creation of humanity and humanity's existence on this planet. And that means we hear, you know, about the birth of the Titans and the birth of the Olympians, how the Olympians overthrew the Titans, how they became, you know, top dog gods on Mount Olympus. We hear about humans being created, we hear about the first woman, Pandora, etc. This is fantastic if you want that sort of context. Of course, there are certainly variations on the myths that Hesiod tells in this book. I also find there is a quite overt misogynistic overtone to Hesiod's work because, I don't know, some women dumped him in the past and he held it against her in his writing. But I do think this book provides fantastic context, fantastic first versions, introductions to these myths. It's really interesting. Hesiod, again, is a bit of an icon of Greek literature who will continue to be referenced in years to come. So worth checking out. Then we have a collection of poems which sort of bridges the archaic and classical era. It's from the sort of late 500s, early 400s, which I know is odd to hear flipped round if you're more accustomed to recent dates. But this book is Pindar's complete odes. So there are various different collections of odes in here, which were specifically victory odes that Pindar wrote in honour of Olympian victors, so those that won the Olympic Games. He would write these dedicatory odes to, celebrating their prowess, but in doing that he often compared and contrasted them to mythological heroes and preserved versions of certain ancient Greek myths through those stories. So while these are, you know, celebration odes and that's the context for them, it's basically a collection of Greek myths. Like, this is basically just a short story collection of Greek myths, some which are shorter than others. It covers a massive range, lots of heroes like you would expect, lots of incredible feats and achievements and defeats of monsters to sort of tie in with the Olympic victories, and this one is fantastic for that reason. So when we come to the classical era, as it is termed by modern historians, not the ancients themselves, of ancient Greece, the sort of one genre that you've got to discuss when you're talking about Greek mythology, or really anything about this period, is the Greek tragedy. So this is a period where we see the tragic play absolutely boom, and these were plays which were performed during religious festivals. So that might seem like not very often to maybe a modern eye, but religious festivals were something that were constantly going on to some degree or another, whether they were either being planned or being hosted. And these plays, like I said, were performed during festivals, and then there would be awards handed out for the best play. And these plays were almost exclusively retellings of Greek myths. So there is literally one surviving play which isn't a retelling of a Greek myth, and that is The Persians by Aeschylus, which is the story of the Persian War. So it's about a historical event rather than a mythological event, although those things can obviously be quite blurred when it comes to ancient literature. But even if we consider mythology a sort of form of ancient history, at least to the ancients themselves, then it is certainly a much, much older, much, much more ancient history. And every single other play that survives from the three surviving playwrights, Euripides, Aeschylus and Sophocles, was a retelling of a myth. Now, there, again, only a fraction of these plays are actually surviving. We have references, names and titles of other plays but written by those authors and others, as well as fragments, but those are the three playwrights whose complete plays survive, and each one covers a moment in a myth. And I say a moment because when these plays were originally performed, they would have been part of trilogies. They would have been part of a group of 3 plays that were performed all together that told a larger story. However, almost all of the plays that survive are by themselves now. They no longer have their first part or their second part or their third part. They are all by themselves. They're very lonely, except for Aeschylus's Oresteia, which does have the entire 3 plays inside of it, so obviously covers a much larger portion of that myth, which is the story of Aeschylus's return home from the Trojan War, his murder by his wife Clytemnestra, and then his son Orestes' revenge on Clytemnestra for murdering his father. Although while I don't condone all of Clytemnestra's actions, you can understand why she was pretty angry at Agamemnon if you read the play. Did I say Agamemnon or did I say Aeschylus before? Sorry if I confused my names there for a second, but that's the only trilogy which survives in full. All of the others are standalone plays, we'll call them, that would have originally been part of trilogies. So they're moments in myths, they're very specific mythological events. Like, for example, the story of Medea's revenge against Jason in Euripides' Medea. But what I will say is that quite often we find in Greek tragedies very explicit, intentional rewrites of myths. So we will find some of the earliest versions of certain myths within these plays, and it seems as though these playwrights were the first to write these versions. Whether they're versions that were talked about or they discussed with others or heard from others is a possibility, but they do not seem to have been the popular or standardized versions of these myths until they were performed during these tragedies. And then they may not have even become the standardized versions of those myths, but because they're the versions that survive today, we often think of them as the standardized versions. So I'll use Medea as an example here. So in Euripides' Medea, we know that Medea is angry at Jason for leaving her, cheating on her, abandoning her and her children in a foreign land, and she kills their children because of that. That is part of her revenge. However, we do find in other texts reference to mythological variations where Medea doesn't intentionally kill their children, where it was an accident, or doesn't kill them at all and they were in fact killed by the sort of townspeople. But today, when we think of Medea, I think the most popular version of Medea's myth is the one where she kills her children, probably because of how dramatic and like sort of unbelievable it is to readers and viewers of the play. But worth bearing in mind is that this could have been Euripides' own invention. It may not have even been a version of the myth until Euripides came along. And Euripides in particular is quite experimental when it comes to mythology. So if you'd like to read sometimes quite interesting different variations on a myth, tragic plays are a great place to go. That's not to say that they're all wildly different from other versions of the myth, but some of them are. So that's worth bearing in mind. And if you pick up a copy of one of these myths, obviously the introduction by whatever scholar has introduced it and translates it will often give you a bit of that context itself. And I can't go and because there's so many, I can't go over every single tragic play in this video, but like I said, we have 3 main playwrights and we have a variety of different plays by each one, such as the Oresteia, such as Antigone, such as Medea, and I'll perhaps link a few more down below and insert some pictures on the screen so you can get a bit more of a feel of them, but there are plenty. That then brings us to the Hellenistic era and beyond, starting with personal preference here, but one of my favourite pieces of ancient Greek literature, which is Apollonius of Rhodes' Argonautica, or as it is variously titled, Jason and the Argonauts or Jason and the Golden Fleece. This edition says Jason and the Golden Fleece, and as you can see, it is quite heftily read, reread and tabbed. This is my edition from my undergraduate at university when I actually wrote my dissertation partially on this book. So love this book, absolutely adore it. But what exactly is it? So this is another epic poem. We're back with the genre of Homer, but in a slightly shorter form. During this period, the Hellenistic period, there was a bit of experimentation in terms of the form poetry and literature took, and you find some shorter epic poems, although it's still like a decent narrative length. And this is the story of Jason, the Greek hero, who travels to Colchis in search of the Golden Fleece of legend and meets the princess and witch Medea, who is the daughter of the man who owns the Golden Fleece at this moment in time. And even if you don't recognise names like Jason and Medea, you'll probably recognise other figures in this book. For example, one of the crew on the Argo, which is the ship they travel on, is Heracles, aka Hercules. So we get to see various different heroes and heroines aboard this ship, and this is one version of that story where they travel again, a little bit like in the Odyssey, so you get this sort of like insight into different parts of the Mediterranean and the sea that they journey across, and the different creatures and figures and seers and prophets and gods and goddesses that they meet. And I really like that about these adventure style epic stories. You really get to meet a lot of different people and start to understand how interconnected these myths are, and this is just a great story. It's just a great story. I can't say any more than that. I think this is a fantastic book. Highly recommend reading it. But if you really want to appreciate how interwoven Greek mythology is, like how connected these stories are and these characters are, how a hero you might think of from one story is actually maybe the uncle of another hero, or maybe hung out with another hero in one of his adventures, then this is the book for you. This is the Library of Greek Mythology by Apollodorus, or Pseudo-Apollodorus. We don't actually know the identity of the writer of this collection, but it is in essence a collection of Greek mythology. Once again, a bit like Pindar's Odes, if you pick this up, what you can expect is sort of a short story collection, starting with the creation of the universe and travelling all the way through the history of the gods and the goddesses of Greek mythology into the stories of the heroes and heroines and monsters, etc. And some of the stories are longer than others, some are better known than others, and on occasion Apollodorus will also mention that there's this variation on a myth or this variation on a myth. He doesn't cover everything. I'm not going to give this book credit for literally covering every single variation on a myth or myth that exists, but it's a really good broad overview and a really great book for giving you that sort of foundational understanding of the variety and interconnectedness of Greek myth. It is a later book, so it is pulling a lot from earlier works and from sort of changes that have happened in Greek mythology and Greek religion since, say, our Homeric books. This is from the Roman Empire period, in which ancient Greece was under the control of the Roman Empire, so again, much later than all the other books we've talked about so far, but still a fantastic place to go. And I like this edition because it's got a little glossary in the back where you can basically look up any figure in Greek mythology you're interested in and find what myths they appear in this. Again, I won't say any book covers all of Greek mythology, but great starter. Then last but not least, for my ancient Greek texts in this video, I have a book that's a little less talked about but could be of interest to you. This is another epic poem from the period of the Roman Empire, although again like 2 centuries after Apollodorus, so even later than that, which is Quintus Smyrnius's The Fall of Troy. And in some ways this is a sequel to the Iliad, and the original Greek title is the Post-Homerica, so post-Homer, and this story follows the events of the Trojan War after the Iliad, after the death of Achilles. So if you kind of want a book that fills in that gap between, you know, the Iliad and the Odyssey, although they're not obviously exact sequels or exact mashups, then this is a lot of fun, and it's one I don't see talked about as often. But with that, we come to the final portion of this video, which is books that aren't necessarily books about exclusively Greek mythology or ones to teach you Greek myths, but which I actually think make great further reading to expand your understanding of Greek mythology more generally, as well as mythology as a whole. And that begins with world mythology. So I think although it's a lot of fun to study ancient Greek mythology in its own right, like I very much value that, I think it can really aid in your understanding of Greek mythology and its history to understand a little bit more about mythology as a concept and world mythology, because none of these things, none of these mythologies, none of these cultures or societies or civilizations exist in a vacuum. For example, you'll find that in later ancient Greek history, for example, you see the worship of ancient Egyptian goddesses like Isis because people are mingling. And I think it's just fun to consider mythology more widely. And if you'd like an example of that sort of travelling of mythology and that interconnectedness of mythology, which isn't exclusively about ancient Greece but which does cover ancient Greece, I really like this book as a case study, which is Women's Lore, 4,000 Years of Sirens, Serpents and Succubi. This is a history of a figure of mythology, or at least figures of mythology who are related to one another, which are the serpentine women, or the women associated with serpents, who seem to crop up in various different mythologies, and you can sometimes trace that connection from, you know, going back to ancient Persia, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, medieval stories, etc. And I really love that it gives you that taste of that interconnectedness. And there is parts of this book that are about ancient Greece, but within the context of a wider sort of history and a wider story, so I really like that. Then we have a book more explicitly about European mythology, which is From Olympus to Camelot, The World of European Mythology, by David Leeming, which again like traces certain mythological traditions throughout Europe, some which seem completely disconnected, some which may share similarities and connections, however, and I think again really fun to trace that history. Then, because as an author it is a requirement to mention one of my books in every video, and I'm not sorry about that, if you would like a book that takes a more modern perspective on Greek mythology and looks at one of the ways in which Greek mythology continues to thrive and survive in the modern era, but which isn't necessarily about the ancients themselves, I did write this little book, All the Violet Tiaras, Queering the Greek Myths, which is about how Greek mythology is something that has remained very important and significant to the LGBTQ plus community in the 20th and 21st centuries, and how we express that and adapt that in literature. So, you know, just like a little side note, a little bit further reading if you're interested. But hopefully this video was of use to you. I hope it wasn't too much information to take in. If you have any questions whatsoever, please do leave them in the comments down below. I'd love to talk more about this subject, potentially provide more recommendations on specific topics if you'd like that. If you'd like books to check out for one specific myth, let me know. I'll recommend you some. And in the meantime, I'd love to know what your favourite Greek myth is. Of all the myths you've encountered thus far, whether it be through podcasts, TV, film, literature, talking to your friends, what has been your favourite and what would you like to learn more about? Until next time though, happy reading and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone!